My grandmother carried me back into her own bedroom and put me on the table. She set the precious bottle down beside me. "What time are those witches having supper in the dining room?" she asked. 8 o'clock, I said. She looked at her watch. "It is now 6:10, she said. "We've got until 8 o'clock to work out our next move." Suddenly her eye fell upon Bruno. He was still in the banana bowl, on the table. He had eaten 3 bananas and was now attacking a 4th. He had become immensely fat. "There's Bruno." "That's quite enough," my grandmother said, lifting him out of the bowl and putting him on the tabletop. "I think it's time we return this little fellow to the bosom of his family. Don't you agree, Bruno?" Bruno scowled at her. I had never seen a mouse scowl before, but he managed it. A scowl's kind of like a dirty look. "My parents let me eat as much as I want," he said. "I'd rather be with them than with you." "Of course you would," my grandmother said. "Do you know where your parents might be at this moment?" "They were in the lounge not long ago," I said, "but I saw them sitting there as we dashed through on our way here." "Right," my grandmother said. "Let's go and see if they're still there. Do you want to come along?" she asked, looking at me. "Yes, please," I said. "I shall put you both in my handbag," she said. "Keep quiet and stay out of sight. If you must peep out now and again, don't show more than your nose." Her handbag was a large, bulgy, black leather affair with a tortoise-shell clasp. She picked up Bruno and me and popped us into it. "I shall leave the clasp undone," she said, "but be sure to keep out of sight." I had no intention of keeping out of sight. I wanted to see everything. I seated myself in a little side pocket inside the bag near the clasp, and from there I was able to poke my head out whenever I wanted to. "Hey!" Bruno called out. "Give me the rest of that banana I was eating." Bruno doesn't have very good manners, does he? There's no thank you or please. "Oh, all right," my grandmother said. "Anything to keep you quiet." She dropped the half-eaten banana into the bag and then slung the bag over her arm and marched out of the room and went thumping along the corridor with her walking stick. She went down in the lift to the ground floor and made our way. We went down in the lift to the ground floor and made our way through the reading room to the lounge. And there, sure enough, sat Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins in a couple of armchairs with a low, round, glass-covered table between them. Remember, the lift was the elevator. There were several other groups in there as well, but the Jenkins were the only couple sitting alone. Mr. Jenkins was reading a newspaper. Mrs. Jenkins was knitting something large and mustard-colored. And over my nose and eyes were above, only my nose and eyes were above the clasp of my grandmother's handbag, but I had a super view. I could see everything. My grandmother, dressed in black lace, went thumping across the floor to the lounge and halted in front of the Jenkins table. "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins?" she asked. Mr. Jenkins looked up over the top of his newspaper and frowned. "Yes," he said. "I am Mr. Jenkins. What can I do for you, madam?" "I'm afraid I have some rather alarming news for you," she said. "It's about your son, Bruno." "What about Bruno?" Mr. Jenkins said. Mrs. Jenkins looked up but went on knitting. "What's the little blighter been up to now?" Mr. Jenkins asked. "I'm sure he's raiding the kitchen, I suppose." "Well, it's a bit worse than that," my grandmother said. "Do you think we might go somewhere more private while I tell you about it?" "Private?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Why do we have to be private?" Now we can see why Bruno doesn't really have manners, right? This is not an easy thing for me to explain," my grandmother said. "I'd much rather we all went up to your room and sat down before I tell you anymore." Well, Mr. Jenkins lowered his paper and Mrs. Jenkins stopped knitting. "I don't want to go to my room, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "I'm quite comfortable here. Thank you very much." He was a large, coarse man, and he wasn't used to being pushed around by anybody. "Kindly state your business, and then you leave us alone," he added. He spoke as though he was addressing someone who was trying to sell him a vacuum cleaner in the back door. So he's just very rude, and that's Grandmama trying to be nice, trying to explain about Bruno, but they don't really seem to want to listen, do they? She's trying. My poor grandmother, who had been doing her best to be as kind to them as possible, now began to bristle a bit herself. "We really can't talk here," she said. "There are too many people. This is a rather delicate and personal matter." "I'll talk where I want to, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "Now come on now, out with it. If Bruno's broken a window or smashed your spectacles, then I'll pay for the damage, but I'm not budging out of this seat." One or two other groups in the room were beginning to stare at us now. "Where is Bruno anyway?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Tell him to come here and see me." "Well, he's here already," my grandmother said. "He's in my handbag." That's a purse. She patted the big floppy leather bag with her walking stick. "What the heck do you mean he's in your handbag?" Mr. Jenkins said. Are you trying to be funny?" Mrs. Jenkins said, very prim. No, there's nothing funny about this, my grandmother said. Your son has suffered a rather unfortunate mishap. That's like an accident. He's always suffering mishaps, Mr. Jenkins says. He suffers from overeating, and then he suffers from wind. You should hear him after supper. He sounds like a brass band. But a good dose of castor oil soon puts him right again. Where is the little beggar? I already told you, my grandmother said. He's in my handbag. But I do think it might be better if we went somewhere private before you meet him in his present state. This woman is mad. She's crazy, Mrs. Jenkins said. Tell her to go away. The plain fact is, my grandmother said, that your son Bruno has been rather drastically altered. Altered? Shouted Mr. Jenkins. What the devil do you mean altered? Go away, Mrs. Jenkins said. You're a silly old woman. I'm trying to tell you as gently as I possibly can that Bruno really is in my handbag, my grandmother said. My own grandson actually saw them doing it to him. Saw who doing what to him, for heaven's sake, shouted Mr. Jenkins. He had a black mustache which jumped up and down when he shouted. Saw the witches turn him into a mouse, my grandmother said. Call the manager, dear, Mrs. Jenkins said to her husband. Have this mad woman thrown out of the hotel. At this point, my grandmother's patience became gone, and it came to an end, and she fished around in her handbag, and she found Bruno. She lifted him out and dumped him on the glass-top table by them. Mrs. Jenkins took one look at the fat little brown mouse who was still chewing a bit of banana, and she let out a shriek that rattled the crystals in the chandelier. She sprang out of her chair, yelling, It's a mouse taken away! I cannot stand the things! It's Bruno, my grandmother said. You nasty, cheeky old woman, shouted Mr. Jenkins. He started flapping his newspaper at Bruno, trying to sweep him off the table. My grandmother rushed forward and managed to grab hold of him just before he was swept away. Mrs. Jenkins was still screaming her head off, and Mr. Jenkins was towering over us and shouting, Get out of here! How dare you frighten my wife like that? Take your filthy mouse away this instant. Help! Screamed Mrs. Jenkins. Her face had gone the color of the underside of a fish. Well, I did my best, my grandmother said, and with that she turned and sailed out of the room, carrying Bruno with her. When we got back to the bedroom, my grandmother took both me and Bruno out of her handbag and put us on the table. Why on earth didn't you speak up and tell your father who you were? She said to Bruno. I had my mouth full, Bruno said. He jumped straight into the bowl of bananas and went on eating. What a very disagreeable little boy you are, my grandmother said to him. Not a boy, I said, a mouse. Quite right, my darling, but we don't have time to worry about him at this moment. We have plans to make. In about an hour and a half's time, all the witches will be going down to supper in the dining room, right? Right, I said. And every one of them has got to be given a dose of mouse maker, she said. How on earth are we going to do that? Well, Grandmama, I said, I think you're forgetting that a mouse can go places where human beings can't. That's quite right, she said, but even a mouse can't go creeping around on the tabletop carrying a bottle and sprinkling mouse maker all over the witch's roast beef without being spotted. I wasn't thinking of doing it in the dining room, I said. Then where? She asked. In the kitchen, I said, while their food is being got ready. My grandmother stared at me. My darling child, she said slowly, I do believe that turning you into a mouse has doubled your brain power. A little mouse, I said, could go scuttling around the kitchen among the pots and pans, and if he's very careful, no one will ever see him. Brilliant, my grandmother cried out. By golly, I think you've got this. The only thing is, I said, how will I know which food is theirs? I don't want to put it in the wrong saucepan. It would be disastrous if I turned all the other guests into mice by mistake, and especially you, Grandmama. Well, then you're going to have to creep into the kitchen and find a good hiding place, and wait and just listen. Just lie there in some dark cranny listening and listening to what the cooks are saying. And then, with a bit of luck, somebody's going to give you a clue. Whenever they have a very big party to cook for, the food is always prepared separately. Right, I said, that's what I shall have to do. I shall wait there, and I shall listen, and I shall hope for a bit of luck. It's going to be very dangerous, my grandmother said. Nobody welcomes a mouse in the kitchen. If they see you, they're going to squash you to death. I won't let them see me, I said. And don't forget you're going to be carrying the bottle, she said, so you won't be running nearly so quick and nippy. I could run quite fast standing up with the bottle in my arms. I said, I just did it now, don't you remember? I came all the way up from the Grand High Witch's room carrying it. What about unscrewing the top? She said, that might be difficult for you. Let me try, I said. I took hold of the little bottle, and using my front paws, I found that I was able to unscrew the cap quite easily. Here he is. He's pretty talented with those little paws. That's great, my grandmother said. You really are a very clever mouse. She glanced at her watch. At 7:30, she said, I shall go down to the dining room for supper with you in my handbag. I shall then release you under the table together with the precious bottle, and from then on you're going to be on your own. You will have to work your way unseen across the dining room to the door that leads into the kitchen. There will be waiters going in and out of the door all the time. You'll have to choose the right moment and nip in behind one of them, and for heaven's sakes, be sure you don't get trodden on or squeezed in the door. I'll try not to, I said. And whatever happens, you mustn't let them catch you. Don't keep talking about it, Grandmama. You're making me nervous. You're a brave little fellow, she said. I do love you. What shall we do with Bruno, I asked. Bruno looked up. I'm coming with you, he said, speaking with his mouth full of banana. I'm not going to miss my supper. My grandmother considered this for a moment. I'll take you along, she said, if you promise to stay in my bag and keep absolutely silent. Will you pass food down to me from the table? Said Bruno. Yes, she said, if you promise to behave yourself. Would you like something to eat, my darling? She said to me. No, thank you, I said. I'm too excited to eat. I've got to keep fit and frisky for the big job ahead. It's a big job, all right, my grandmother said. You will never do a bigger one. The time has come, my grandmother said. The great moment has arrived. Are you ready, my darling? It was exactly 7:30, and Bruno was in the bowl finishing that 4th banana. Hang on, he said. Just a few more bites. No, my grandmother said. We've got to go. She picked him up and held him tight in her hand, and she was very tense and nervous. I had never seen her like that before. I'm going to put you both in my handbag now, she said, but I shall leave the clasp undone. She popped Bruno in there first. I waited, clutching the little bottle to my chest. Now you, she said. She picked me up and gave me a kiss on the nose. Good luck, my darling. And by the way, you do realize you have a tail, don't you? A what? I said. You have a tail, a long, curly tail. Wow, I must say it never occurred to me, I said. Good gracious me, so I have. I see it now. I could actually move it. It's rather grand, isn't it? I mention it only because it might come in useful when you're climbing about in the kitchen, my grandmother said. You could curl it around, you could hook it onto things, you could swing from it and lower yourself to the ground from high places. Wow, I wish I'd known this before, I said. I could have practiced using it. Too late now, my grandmother said. We gotta go. She popped me into her handbag with Bruno, and at once I took up my usual perch in the small side pocket so I could poke my head out and see what was going on. My grandmother picked up her walking stick, and out she went into the corridor to the lift. She pressed the button, and the lift came, and she got in, and there was no one in there with us. Listen, she said, I will not be able to talk to you much once we're in the dining room. If I do, people will think I'm Dottie and talking to myself. The lift reached the ground floor and stopped with a jerk, and my grandmother walked out of it and crossed the lobby of the hotel and entered the dining room. And it was a huge room with gold decorations on the ceiling and big mirrors around the walls, and the regular guests always had their own tables reserved for them, and most of them were already in their places and starting to eat their suppers, and waiters were buzzing all over the place carrying plates and dishes, and our table was a small one, right beside the right-hand wall about halfway down the room. My grandmother made her way to it and sat down. And peeping out of the handbag, I could see in the very center of the room 2 long tables that were not yet occupied. Each one of them carried a notice fixed to a sort of a silver stick, and the notice said it's reserved for the members of the RSPCC. We know who they are. So this is where Grandmama's table is. That's the waiter right there, and then just another guest over here. But this table down here says it's reserved. It's a really long table, 2 of them, for the members of the RSPCC. They aren't there yet. My grandmother looked towards the long tables and said nothing, and she unfolded her napkin and spread it out over the handbag in her lap, and she gently slid under the napkin and took hold of me gently with her hand. With the napkin covering me, she lifted me up close to her face, and she whispered, I'm about to put you on the floor under the table. The tablecloth reaches almost to the ground so no one will see you. Have you got hold of the bottle? Yeah, I whispered back. I'm ready, Grandmama. Just then a waiter in a black suit came and stood by our table, and I could see his legs from under the napkin, and as soon as I heard his voice, I knew who he was. His name was William. Good evening, madam, he said to my grandmother. Where is the little gentleman tonight? He's not feeling well, my grandmother said. He's staying in his room. I'm sorry to hear that, William said. Today there is green pea soup to start with, and for the main course, you have a choice of either grilled fillet of sole or roast lamb. Pea soup and lamb for me, please, my grandmother said, but please don't hurry it, William. I'm in no rush tonight. In fact, you could bring me a glass of dry sherry first. Of course, madam, William said, and he went away. My grandmother pretended she had dropped something, and as she bent down, she slid me out from under the napkin onto the floor under the table. "Go, darling, go," she whispered. And then she straightened up again. And I was on my own now. And I stood clasping the little bottle, and I knew exactly where the door into the kitchen was. I had to go about halfway around the enormous dining room to reach it, and here goes, I thought. And like a flash, I skittled out from under the table, and I made for the wall, and I had no intention of going across the dining room floor. It was far too risky. My plan was to cling close to the skirting of the wall all the way around until I reached the kitchen door. He's got to be very careful. There's lots of people there. And he's running as fast as he can, trying not to get seen and trying not to get stepped on. I ran. Oh, how I ran. I don't think anyone saw me. They were all too busy eating. But to reach the door leading to the kitchen, I had to cross the main entrance to the dining room, and was just about to do this when in poured a great flood of females. And I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the bottle. And at first I saw only the shoes and ankles of these women who were surging in through the door, but when I glanced up a bit higher, I knew at once who they were. They were the witches coming in to dinner. I waited until they had all passed by me. Something happened, and all of a sudden the computer stopped working. I'm so sorry. I don't know what that was. Okay. I waited till they had all passed by me, and then I dashed on towards the kitchen door. A waiter opened it to go in, and I nipped in after him, and I hid behind a big garbage bin on the floor, and I stayed there for several minutes. Oh my gosh, it was so scary. And then I listened to the talk and the racket, and by golly, what a place that kitchen was. The noise and the steam and the clatter of the pots and pans. And the cooks all shouting, and the waiters all rushing in and out from the dining room yelling the food orders to the cooks. 4 soups and 2 lambs and 2 fish for table 28. 3 apple pies and 2 strawberry ice creams for number 17. Stuff like that was going on all the time. And not far above my head, there was a handle sticking out from under the side of the garbage bin, and still clutching the bottle, I gave a leap, turned a somersault in the air, and caught hold of the handle with the end of my tail. Suddenly, there I was, swinging to and fro upside down, and it was terrific, and I loved it. This, I told myself, is how a trapeze artist in a circus must feel as he goes swishing through the air high up in the circus tent. The only difference was that this trapeze could only swing backwards and forwards, and my trapeze, my tail, could swing me in any direction I wanted. Perhaps I would become a circus mouse after all. Just then, a waiter came in with a plate in his hand, and I heard him saying, "Yeah, the old hag over there on table 14 says this meat is too tough. She wants another portion." And one of the cooks said, "Give me your plate." And I dropped to the floor, and I peeped around the garbage bin. So this is somebody who was eating, and they sent back their food complaining about how the meat was too tough. This is disgusting what they do next. I saw the cook scrape the meat off the plate and slap on another bit. And then he said, "Come on, boys, give 'em some gravy." And he carried the plate around to everyone in the kitchen, and do you know what they did? Every one of those cooks and kitchen boys spit onto the old lady's plate. "See how she likes it now," said the cook, handing back the plate to the waiter. So in real life, if this happened, those people would all be fired, as we know, and they should be, because yuck. But that was really a icky part of the story.